Tonight our speaker is Denis Kania, and he's one of the founding members of the DuPage Birding Club. He's been birding for a very long time and has traveled the world extensively looking for birds. He just returned from a trip to Oaxaca, Mexico, where he saw 5 hummingbird species that he had never seen before. And this brings the total number of hummingbird species that he has seen to 217. And today he's going to talk about hummingbirds and how to attract them to our yards. I'll give it over to Denis.
Hi there. Thank you, Wendy. And welcome to everybody. Great to be here. I'm going to do a little screen share here. And yeah, my favorite bird family is hummingbirds. So it's unfortunate that I live here. So I have to travel great distances in order to get new hummingbirds for my list. Anyway, great to be here. And we're going to cover a lot about just one particular species of hummingbird today, and that'll be the ruby-throated hummingbird, the one that we get to see. And so that's the one we're going to be trying to attract to our yard. And some of the things that I do want to cover today is our attraction and appreciation for hummingbirds. I'm going to give you a little world perspective on hummingbirds just because they are all over the place, and what we see is one thin slice of the hummingbird family. So I want to at least give you a little perspective on all the other hummingbirds that are available out there in the world. We'll talk about the Midwest hummingbirds, and then how to attract them to our backyards. We're going to talk about food sources and some favorite plant species. We'll talk about how to mix up nectar for them as well. And one of the most important things we'll talk about today is cleaning your hummingbird feeder. And we'll talk a little bit about mortality and then some of the courtship and nesting for ruby-throated hummingbirds. And right off the bat, you can see that this has an international flavor to it. Here's a sapphire spangled emerald, and that's a hummingbird that you would see down in Argentina. And when I was putting this program together, someone emailed me and was asking me what this species was. So that's what it turned out to be. And I just decided, as long as I had it on my computer here, I just kind of threw it in on the intro page. So to start things off, talking a little bit about the appreciation of hummingbirds. And hummingbirds and our admiration of them goes way back in time. So there are many artifacts that are uncovered that are representations of hummingbirds. Here we have a little carving that is a hummingbird. If you've ever been to Peru and had the opportunity to fly over the Nazca lines out in the desert, there is a nice image of a hummingbird, which just totally amazes me that they're able to create something like that. This image here is actually a petroglyph, and it's from New Mexico, and there's the Albuquerque Petroglyph National Monument, and I visited that just a few years ago, and I had put this program together long before that. Well, when I was out there, I actually located this very image. So now this is my photograph in here, as opposed to swiping that off of the internet. And it was pretty exciting to be able to witness that myself. And here's some pottery with some hummingbirds on it. And this is an Inuit drumhead here. And then usually when I do this talk in person, I tell everybody to look to the person to the left of them and check their shoulder out, because I'm still searching for this particular hummingbird. It's a ruby topaz, but I haven't found the person that it belongs to yet. So maybe another time we can do that check, or somebody can volunteer that it's them. So you can tell that we really admire hummingbirds simply by the names that we give them. Here we have some examples of hummingbirds I've seen in my travels. This is a sparkling violet ear here, buff-winged star frontlet, crowned wood nymph, empress brilliant, rufous crested coquette, velvet purple coronet, and there are many other names. There's actually quite a few hummingbirds, but many of them are sapphires or emeralds or wood stars or hill stars, sunbeams, sun angels, comets, and jewel fronts. So we obviously think a lot of hummingbirds because of the names that we give them. Obviously, we hold them in high regard. And to give you just a little flavor for the hummingbird universe, there's a little over 360 species of hummingbirds in the world. So with my 217, I still have a little ways to go, but I'm constantly chipping away at that number. And if you take a close look at these two maps that I've drawn, and you can see I've thrown some numbers in here for the various countries. And here, little Ecuador, which is on the equator and intersects with the spine of the Andes. That little country, which is about the size of Colorado, has 163 species of hummingbirds. And then as you pan out from that point, the numbers start to decrease. So even Peru and Colombia in particular, which has more birds than any other country in the entire world. These are two countries that are each 5 times the size of Ecuador, but you can see the numbers are starting to decline already. And that happens if you go further and further south, or if you go further and further north. You get all the way up into Alaska, and really there's only one breeding species of hummingbird up there, which is the rufous hummingbird. In recent past, they're starting to get Anna's hummingbird nesting up there, so I'm going to have to change my my illustration here. But coming up here through North America, here in all of the United States, we have about 16 species. And of those 16, 5 of them make it up into Canada, and of those 5, just 1, again, makes it all the way up to Alaska. The same thing is happening as you move down in the southern hemisphere. By the time you get all the way down here to Tierra del Fuego, once again, you're down to just 1 species. So even a country as large as Brazil, which, it's a very huge country, they only have 90 species. Argentina is 24, but again, if you get all the way down to the tip, just the 1. So that kind of gives you a little perspective on where the hummingbirds are in the world. And here's a few examples, just so you get to see a little bit of the diversity. Here's the giant hummingbird, and this is a hummingbird that's about the size of a starling. I'm sure you all are familiar with starlings. You see them walking around in your yard, picking away in the grass. And so here's a hummingbird that's actually as large as those starlings. And then we have the bee hummingbird, which is only found in Cuba, and it's probably smaller than your pinky finger. There's a sword-billed hummingbird here, and there's a very busy background here in my photograph. But the bill base is right here where my cursor is, and the tip is all the way out here. So that's a pretty amazing looking hummingbird. And then we also have something called the white-tipped sicklebill, which has this extremely decurved bill. So a lot of diversity. This is my next target, marvelous spatula tail. It's found only in a small area in northern Peru, and I'm going to be going there in September. So can't wait to add that one. And here's some other representations, other things that I've photographed, or I guess I borrowed one here. Long-tailed sylph, wire-crested thorntail, and frilled coquette. When I was talking to Wendy, I told her about the fact that I had just been down in Oaxaca, and she was curious as to what hummingbirds I did add. And so here they are. I decided to throw those in here. And here's white-eared hummingbird, cinnamon-sided, barreline, and beautiful. They're all beautiful. And dusky hummingbird. So those are the 5 that I just added in my most recent trip. Let's get back to the main thrust of the program, and that's talking about hummingbirds in our area. And so the hummingbird that we would expect to see all the time would be ruby-throated hummingbird. And looking at the range map, you can see that it covers, all of the eastern half of the United States, even starts to expand towards the west up here in Canada. And they do migrate down a couple of different routes. They do take a land-based route coming through Mexico, but they can also do some island hopping, leaving Florida and getting out here into the Caribbean. And some of them actually probably make that long water crossing across the Gulf as well. But the farthest south that they end up going is Panama. They don't make it into South America. And I have seen them in Panama. I was just recently in Costa Rica, and I did see them there too. So here's what our male ruby-throated hummingbird would look like. And you can see it has the ruby throat. Fairly easy to identify, especially since it's the only one that we have. This is a immature male. You can see there's like real fine speckling in the throat area here. And so that's how I can tell that that would be a male. If the throat is completely clean, as in this example here, then that's a female. So even though we see some variety in the hummingbirds that are coming to our feeders, they are all this species. But here's a map that I threw in here. This is a representation of the migration in 2010. So you can tell I've been doing this program for a while. So all these birds that are migrating upward from the south, they're moving up through the eastern half of the United States. And in this particular year, we had our first sighting in the Chicagoland area of ruby-throated hummingbird was actually on April 4th. And this year, things are quite a bit delayed, and the first sightings are just coming in now. So, you know, a couple of weeks later than what we had in 2010. But it's kind of interesting. You can actually look at the dates on here, and you can kind of see how things track forward. And you actually, if you look at this and study it carefully enough, you can actually see that there are two different populations actually moving in our direction. So the ones coming through the continent from this direction, from Florida. And then there's a different series of dates coming in and coming up through that land bridge through Mexico and then through Texas. And you do, if you do study this very carefully, you can actually, you know, discern there are two different groups kind of making their way towards us. Well, it always used to be the case that we only had to worry about ruby-throated hummingbirds here, but something strange is now happening over the last 10, 15 years. This is a Western species. It's called the rufous hummingbird. They are, as I mentioned, the only species that historically has nested all the way up here in Alaska. And so their breeding range is really in the extreme far northwest here. They do migrate through the west and all the way down into Mexico. And it looks like that's about as far as they get. So that's what their normal migration and range map would look like. But what has started to happen is we have been finding rufous hummingbirds in the southeastern states, where they're showing up in Alabama, they're showing up in Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, Louisiana, all through those states. And because there's a lot of people that are doing banding of hummingbirds, we do get some of these birds banded, and we know that they're successfully making that migration back and forth because some birds are being retrapped that are already banded, and they were banded in the southeastern part of the United States. So the amazing thing that's happening is that their migration route, when they are going down to this corner of North America, they're actually going through Illinois. And so one of my biggest goals is to get a rufous hummingbird in my backyard. So I set up my feeders and I watch, particularly in the fall, you know, with hopes that I'll see a rufous hummingbird. But here's another map similar to what we were looking at with the ruby-throated. It doesn't have all the dates in it. It kind of just gives you date ranges for the various symbols here. And so here's all the states where we're finding that, you know, there are winter sightings. And then as migration starts to occur, you can see the vast majority of the birds are moving up this way. What is really mind-blowing to me is that if you look over here to Maine, we actually have some birds that are now showing up in Maine. Rather than taking their traditional route back up into their traditional breeding areas, we have a couple birds that now showing up in Maine. And I think if that continues, it's just a matter of time before we end up with a second species of hummingbird breeding east of the Mississippi. So I think that's pretty remarkable. This is happening in our lifetime. I don't have an answer for why that's happening, but they are successfully surviving in the southeast here and overwintering and passing along those genes to more and more rufous hummingbirds. So here's a rufous hummingbird that was actually seen in Lisle, Illinois on December 1st in 2020. And I don't normally chase birds, I chase destinations, but I thought, you know, as much as I've been trying to get a rufous hummingbird in my backyard, I felt like I could drive 10 minutes to get to actually see a rufous hummingbird near me. So this is a female that was captured. It actually, captured on film. It actually arrived on December 1st. And so I started doing some research on sightings of rufous hummingbirds in our area. And it turns out that they tend to be a very late migrant. And they do show up in November, and there are some sightings in December, obviously. This bird showed up on December 1st. It stuck around for close to 10 days, I believe. And before it did leave, it was banded. And shortly after it was banded, maybe a day or two later, it did decide to take off. So we don't know where it went, but it was visiting us for that long period of time. These people were remarkable. They called me up and said they thought they had this odd hummingbird coming to their feeder. And I just thought it was odd that they still had a hummingbird feeder out on December 1st. But this bird was, you know, coming, and they were, religiously taking the feeder in at night. once it got dark, and they would keep it from freezing. And then at first light, they would put it out every morning. They got tired of that, so they actually found on the market someplace there's actually electrically heated hummingbird feeders. So they bought one of those and had that hanging on their front porch. So try as I might to get one of these birds to my yard, what I found out is that I was using the wrong kind of landscaping methods. So this is the front yard of the house. If you look right here, there's a little red. You can probably not barely see it, but there's a little red disc right there. That's the hummingbird feeder right there. So what I am probably missing in my front yard or even my backyard would be inflatable Thanksgiving decorations and all these other ornamentations that they have all over their yard. So I have to rethink my scheme for getting rufous hummingbirds to my backyard. So let's talk a little bit about actually attracting hummingbirds to the backyard. And it can be as easy as just putting up that feeder. If you're lucky and hummingbirds are moving through, they'll find it. And it could be as simple as that to get them started in your backyard. But a lot of people do have difficulty in doing that, getting that first attraction. So, you start out by putting up that feeder. And then there are, lots of plants that you can add. I have an example here of red salvia. Plants and the flowers don't have to be red, but red is a major attractant for the ruby-throated hummingbirds. So I'm using that as an example here. So adding a lot of vegetation that is going to be, flowering a lot. And if you can go native, is certainly great. If you can't, then something like salvia certainly works. There's a lot more benefit that comes from the natives, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. And then I also threw this up here. This is a mister that was set up on a bird bath so that the hummingbird can come in and bathe within the mist. I almost never see hummingbirds actually taking a bath in a bird bath or anywhere else. I have seen them in nature take a dive into a small shallow pool, and they'll bathe that way. But in my yard, I've never seen them approach the bird bath. But if I am out watering my plants and I have the nozzle on my hose on a very light mist, I will have hummingbirds come fly right up into that spray, and they do that quite often. In fact, if I see them perched nearby, then I automatically dial it down a bit so that they can get in there, and they very, very regularly do that. So anyway, these are some of the basic things you can try out, and hopefully some of that would work for you, and you would start to get hummingbirds coming to the yard. So we always think of hummingbirds, looking for that nectar, but they do eat a variety of things. So here's an example going into some columbine. We have a ruby-throated going in there, and obviously going after nectar. But they also do eat insects. And here's an example of a ruby-throated hummingbird. It looks like an immature male, and it has a little insect in its bill, and you can kind of see some of the insect or spider webbing here. So this hummingbird is actually rated a spider web in order to get an easy meal. But I have on many occasions seen during the breeding season when the females are looking for more protein, rather than go to my hummingbird feeders, they'll actually go kind of scanning the various walls of vegetation in my yard, whether they're some conifers or even the side of my house. And you can tell that they're actually foraging for insects, because there's certainly no flowers available in the areas that they're hovering around. So they are using insects quite a bit. And the third example I have up here is these are sap wells drilled by a sapsucker. And so in a pinch, hummingbirds will actually use sap from a tree if they can't get nectar. And so they know to look for those sap wells. So not only can they get sap from there, but they can also get insects that are trapped in there too. So I have a little story to tell here, and this is to give you a feel for just how curious hummingbirds are, and that's why it should technically be very easy for you to get them to your yard. They're always looking for another meal. They're always looking for another food source. And so by getting those feeders out or getting the right plants out there, you should be able to get them attracted to your yard. And this is an example down in Ecuador. I was on the east slope of the Andes, around 4,500 feet or something like that. We're staying at a lodge. It was pouring rain, so a friend of mine and I were just sitting on the porch watching this bank of hummingbird feeders in front of us. It had really a lot of activity. But the supply of nectar in the feeders was starting to go down, and you can see there's a guy in a yellow rain slicker in the background here. So they were taking the feeders in and washing them and then refilling them, but they hadn't started to bring them back yet. Well, while all this was going on, my friend's husband came out and he was carrying a red book in his hand. And I noticed the hummingbirds were immediately attracted to that. Makes sense, of course. So I asked if I could borrow it, and I put it in my lap, and within seconds I had brown violet ears landing on my knee. So then I decided that if I would put my fingers on the corners of the book, like little perches, like I'm doing here, I could get them to land on my finger. And sure enough, here's it kind of blends in with the handle on the chair, but there's a brown violet ear right here on my finger, and he's actually dipping his head into the dark area between my finger and the book, hoping that that's a hummingbird feeder port, and he's looking for a meal. Of course, he didn't find anything there. Well, at one point, I had hummingbirds all around me, and I actually had one of these, a golden-tailed sapphire, right on the side of my face, and I could literally feel the wings touching my cheek. And the next thing I felt was his bill went into my ear. And the next thing I felt was one little zip of his tongue. And I thought that was pretty bizarre until seconds later, a brown violet ear came up from my lap and was now in my face. And the next thing I felt was his little bill go in my nose. And the next thing after that I felt was a little zip of his tongue. So here it happened 2 times within seconds. And I've been going down to South America, and in situations like this where there's huge banks of hummingbird feeders and there's hummingbirds all over the place, I've never had them take an interest in me before. But these hummingbirds, for some reason, I don't know if it was the heavy rain or what it was, but they were just so intent on finding out any new food source, and so they were obviously checking me out. I went back to the exact same lodge 3 years later, but this time I came equipped with a little jar, and I painted the rim the same color as a hummingbird feeder. You can see it matches pretty well. And I drew a little line. I did some testing at home, so I knew if I put 3 little sugar packets in there, I knew how much water to put in. So I mixed it all up, and here I am approaching these. These are fawn-breasted brilliants, and so I'm approaching them on this feeder, and you can see they're all just like leaning backwards away from me. So for some reason, they didn't want to have anything to do with me on this trip, where 3 years ago we were the best of friends. So I'll never figure that out. But my point is that these birds are so intent on finding food sources, because you can think of them with that high metabolism. They're always just hours away from starvation. So they're always looking for that next meal. I did make up with hummingbirds a few years later. I was in Jamaica, and in this image here, you can see I have a red-billed streamer tail. I don't know if you can see the tail all the way, but the tail goes all the way down to here. So it's a very, very long-tailed hummingbird. It does have a red bill, and these are the little whiskey bottles you used to get on the airplanes, although it doesn't have whiskey in it, but the little bottles like that. So they drill a hole in make it a little port, and they put sugar water in that. And the birds at this sanctuary are habituated to come to people. So I made up with hummingbirds once again, and I had a couple different species coming in to feed and perching on my finger. So you're probably not going to do that in your backyard, but what you can do is here's some plants that you can have in your backyard or add to your backyard. And I've had great success with all of these in my yard. Here's yellow honeysuckle vine, which is a native. Here's rhododendron, wild columbine, even Solomon seal, and dwarf honeysuckle, which even though it has these minuscule little flowers, it's still a huge attractant for hummingbirds. I see them feeding on this quite often. And spiderwort's another example. And I just to get ready for this program, I just ran around my backyard and took pictures of wherever I've seen hummingbirds, dashing around in the yard. And even though something like Solomon seal, it doesn't look like it would be that popular with hummingbirds. But here's an example of them feeding on small flowers like that. So never underestimate the native plants that you're utilizing in your yards. Isn't that great? I think we should watch that one more time. So I got that video from a fine man named Mark Donnelly. Locally, he does some monitoring at Fermilab, which I do. He does dragonflies, and I do birds. So that's how I've gotten to know Mark. Here's some other examples, and so we're now seeing that there's plant species from a variety of habitats. So that, there's many native plants that you can utilize that hummingbirds will be attracted to. So the more you can do in native, I think the better off we'll all be, because in addition to providing nectar for the hummingbirds, our native plants are going to also attract more insects. And aside from even the hummingbirds, there's many other birds species that are going to utilize those insects. Probably out of all the birds that do visit our yard, at least 65% of them are insectivores. And so having these plants in our yard not only is great for the hummingbirds, but it's great for all those other species as well. Here's some more examples. You guys are a whole bunch of plant huggers, so I'm sure you know all these plants pretty well. And here's a listing there. So if you're interested in getting that list, all you have to do right now on your computer is hit your print screen, and you can save that off to a Word document later or something, and then print it off, and then you'll have that information. But if you are going to go to a nursery and you want to make sure that you're getting native plants, you can always verify that by making sure that the scientific name matches up. So I've included that there for you. So let's talk a little bit about making our own hummingbird food. Hummingbird feeders come in many shapes and designs. And once they find the food source, it doesn't matter what that thing looks like, they'll keep showing up, because like I said, they're very interested in finding a food source, protecting that food source, and they just get very protective of it. So a lot of different styles, many different things that you can pick out. A little bit, I'll show you the one that I prefer to use. It's not represented here. I just want to give you some examples of the vast variety. Some of them can be pretty cute, but what you should think about when you're picking out your hummingbird feeder is having to clean it. And so you want something that breaks down easily, and you can get to all the little tiny corners and nooks and crannies in there. So keep that in mind when you are picking out your hummingbird feeder. So to get down to the mixture that we use, it's going to be 1 part sugar to 4 parts water. And you can use cane sugar, which is probably best. You can also even use beet sugar, but don't use any of those other synthetic type sugars or honey. Tap water is fine, and you do not have to boil it. That probably makes the solution mix more readily, but you don't really need to do that. You can just use regular tap water, and you don't have to heat it. If you do go the route where you boil water to make your mixture, then you want to make sure you cool it down before you're going to be feeding that to anyone. And you definitely do not need to add any food coloring to that. So replace that mixture in the feeder at least once a week, and even more frequently if it's very hot out. So once we get into the summertime, you're going to want to be changing that more frequently, because one of the biggest problems that we have for our hummingbirds, and we will talk about mortality in a little bit, but one of the biggest problems is that we can easily kill them at our feeders because of bacteria that's growing. So you want to be very careful about how you're cleaning the feeder, and we'll go into that in more detail as well. So there's a couple of ways you can go when you're mixing your food. I tend to do it in small batches, and so I might just take a couple tablespoons of sugar and then 8 tablespoons of water, and so that's not mixing a lot. But I don't have a lot of traffic in my yard. If I get 4 or 5 hummingbirds in my yard at one time, that's probably the max. So I don't really see the need to mix large quantities and fill up the feeder, and you end up throwing half of it out. So I just put just enough in there to keep them happy for those several days. And then when I see it's getting low, then I go and I bring the feeder in, I clean it, I mix up another small batch, and out it goes. The other route you can take would be to make that large batch, but don't put it all in the feeder. You can keep it in a pitcher in your refrigerator for a couple of weeks, and you can then just refill off of that as you need to. But remember, even though you're just refilling off of that larger batch, it does pay to clean the feeder every time you do that. I can't stress that enough. So here's the whole cleaning process. So once you bring the hummingbird feeder in my yard, you sometimes have to worry about yellow jackets. So I would be, think twice about just bringing it in the house. I usually kind of swish it around quite a bit to make sure that if there are any yellow jackets in there, they're having to swim rather than fly. And I get it to the sink, and I usually hit it with some really hot water to start with. Then you can easily open it up. The style that I have opens up very easily, and I'll show you that example in a little bit. You can see the saucer part breaks apart with just one easy twist. It opens up, and now you can get to every little crevice in there, and you can make sure that you don't see any little dark areas. You want to clean all of those out as much as possible. And soapy water is fine. You can also use a bleach mixture of 1 part bleach to 10 parts water. Some people use vinegar, and again, I would go 1 to 10 with that. But the main thing is to get rid of all those buildup of bacteria that you can see. Anything that's discoloring the feeder shouldn't be there. So after you do that, then it's a rinsing process. Rinse with clear cold water and let it air dry before refilling. And when I am rinsing things out, I usually do a triple rinse. So I rinse once to get the suds off, and then I'll rinse 3 times after that, doing switching back and forth between the 2 surfaces, the inside surface and then the outer surface, and just keep flipping back and forth, but do it 3 times. So here they are just sitting air drying. I don't always have time to air dry it, so I'll just kind of like fan it and make sure there is no residue sitting on it anywhere, and then I try to get it back out to the hummingbirds as quickly as I can. So if all of this sounds like a lot of work, then you probably shouldn't be trying to feed hummingbirds. So I always get questions about those yellow jackets and ants. They're usually pretty pesty around hummingbird feeders. So I decided to throw a new slide in here, and a friend of mine introduced me to something called the Waspinator last year, and it was late in the season when I started experimenting with it, but it seemed to work pretty well. So I'm going to see what happens this year. But basically, this is supposed to represent a paper wasp nest, and you can just hang that on a shepherd's hook near where your hummingbird feeder is. And the yellow jackets apparently don't get along very well with the wasps, so the yellow jackets stay out of the yard. And when I did this, I saw my number of yellow jackets coming in the feeder decrease by probably 80%. And not only did it help there, but it also kept them off my patio as well. So I'm going to try, experimenting with this more this coming year. But the early results it looks pretty positive. So that's something called the Waspinator, and I found it online. Just as that's where I got the picture from. But just a friend just gave it to me, so I didn't actually purchase it myself. And then there's something that you can find in any of your hardware stores. It's called the ant moat. Anyone that's selling you hummingbird feeders probably has one of these as well. And basically, it's just a little cup, and you can see there's a hook on the inside of the cup and then a hook on the bottom of the cup. And so if this is your shepherd's hook, you can just hook the moat on there and just keep it filled with water, and then you hook your hummingbird feeder below it, and now you've eliminated all of your ant problems. Using some of the traditional things that people have suggested, like Vaseline on the shepherd's hook or whatever, can end up being a big problem if it gets on the wings of birds. And I find that it's not all that reliable anyway. Once it rains a little bit, the ants seem to march right past that anyway. My biggest problem is that even though I have bird baths all over my yard, the chickadees don't seem to want to go to the bird baths. But as soon as I put water in these little ant moats, they think it's for them. And I always have a problem with chickadees drinking all the water out of my ant moats. So you have to keep an eye on it and make sure they don't work if you don't have water in there. So you have to keep an eye on it and keep them filled. But they are extremely effective if they're full of water. So we'll talk a little bit about mortality. And there's, one of the biggest problems, which we already mentioned, was that if we don't keep our hummingbird feeders clean, we can have a big problem with bacteria killing the hummingbirds. Spider webs are a huge problem for them. Even though they like to raid the spider webs, they'll go in there looking for food. They also use it for nesting material, which we'll talk about in a minute. But when they visit those spider webs, they can easily get hung up in them themselves. And once they do get entangled a little bit, there's nothing that they can push off on, so they're just trapped there, and they'll just die right there. So leaving a porch or garage open can lead to a hummingbird going inside. They get confused and they can't find their way out. And I've had people bring me hummingbirds that perished in their garage because they just couldn't find their way out. It seems illogical to us that they can fly in, but they can't seem to find their way back out, but it does happen. There are plants that can be a big problem for hummingbirds. Here we have one that's impaled on some burdock. And I've found lots of things getting trapped by burdock. I've seen ruby-crowned kinglets trapped in burdock. I've never seen a hummingbird, but here's a picture to show us that it can happen. I once had a Tennessee warbler trapped in burdock, and when I went to try and release it, he managed to push himself off, and so he escaped. I did find a bat one time, a small brown bat. I guess it's called little brown bat. I found one of those hooked up on burdock. I don't know how it ever managed to come in contact with the burdock, but it did, and it died there. So burdock can be a big problem. There's other plants like that as well. There are things that actually prey upon hummingbirds, like praying mantises, and snakes will actually try to ambush a hummingbird at a feeding station, whether it's a natural one or a platform feeder that we've put out. Window strikes can be a big problem, and pesticides can be a problem in two ways. What they could directly kill the hummingbird, or they eliminate his food source by eliminating all the insects that he would want to feed on. So we'll talk a little bit about courtship and nesting. And male ruby-throated hummingbirds are going to do all the serious lifting. They really do. They're the ones that have to defend the territory. They first pick out a territory based on what kind of food sources are around. The better territory they have, the more likely they're going to be attracting a lot of females. And obviously, the hummingbird that can hang on to that territory must have, a great set of genes. And so that's appealing to the females for that purpose, as well as the fact that all of those food sources are available within that territory. So they're going to mate. And they do some very interesting courtship flights. The males will fly way up into the sky, and they come bombing down towards the female, and using that ruby throat, and just kind of blasting her with a beam of light as they come down. Pretty amazing to watch. But the females will decide that this is a really cool male, and they do end up mating. But from that point on, the female takes over. She's going to build that nest herself. She's going to incubate those eggs herself. She's going to feed the young herself, and watch them all fledge. And while she's busy doing all of that, the male is attracting another female to his territory. And so he's going to do it all again. So you can have multiple females actually mating with one male, and they'll all be utilizing to some extent that same territory. And so when you'll probably notice at your feeders, you end up with really a lot of females coming to your feeders. And then later in the season, maybe you'll notice that there's some immature males as well. But you seldom see the males at your feeders, because the percentage of them within the population is small compared to the other groups. So I did have a male coming to my feeder last year quite often. But other years, I can go the whole season and maybe see a male only once or twice. So those males are doing really a lot in order to hang on to that territory. So they're both doing quite a bit. In the process of building that nest, there's some examples of nests here. You can see they are quite small. Those eggs are about the size of a pea, so they're very, very small. So the opening of the nest is very small. And when they gather all this material to build a nest, they're using a lot of plant fiber, especially on the inside. They're using some very, very fluffy things like cattail fluff or things like that. And in order to hold it all together, they go to that spider web, and they grab some of the spider webbing, and they use that to wrap around the outside. And it's sticky, so it kind of holds things together. And then they'll gather up lichens, and for camouflage purposes, they'll attach lichen to the outer side of the nest. But what's remarkable about using the spider webbing is that it is expandable. It does stretch. So as those eggs hatch and you have little chicks in there and they start to grow, and obviously they're not going to fit in here very well, the nest itself starts to expand along with the size of the chicks. So I think that's quite remarkable. So once again, they're going to that spider web to get resources, and every time they do that, they run the risk of getting caught up in there. One of the kind of cool things that I want to mention, so if this hummingbird is sitting on her eggs in the nest, they have such tiny feet, and their feet are so weak that they don't use them to walk at all. So even a hummingbird sitting on a nest, if she wants to adjust herself, she doesn't move around using her feet in the nest. She actually will hover. She will take off and change her position and then re-alight on those eggs. So without actually using her feet, she's actually flying up and down in order to reposition herself. I think that's pretty amazing. Here's an example. Can you guys see the, try and find the hummingbird nest in this image? I'll give you a couple seconds and we'll play another little movie here. There, she takes you right to it. So she's still in the process of building that nest. She's putting material in there, I do believe. I'm not sure what she was collecting over here. Let's look at that one more time. She's collecting something out there on the branches, comes over, but it looks like she's working the edge. I don't think she's trying to feed little babies in there. But if you can find one, you're a pretty lucky soul. I very seldom run into the nest. If you're lucky enough to see the hummingbirds gathering nesting material and you can watch where they go, that would be one way to find them. But once those nests are built, it's pretty hard to locate them. So that kind of brings us to our close here. I'm going to leave a bunch of time for questions. I'm sure there'll be questions. But thanks for taking the time to attend the webinar. And hopefully I've given you some bird food for thought. And if you want to learn more about birds and related topics, I hope you'll join us and explore all things bird related at the DuPage Birding Club education channel. And you can find the DuPage website right here. And you can go there and you'll eventually find a link that takes you to an education channel that now has probably about 60 releases on it of all sorts of bird related topics. So I'm going to stop my screen share here and we can do a bunch of Q&A. I hope there's a lot of questions. I don't see much in the chat right now, but we're going to hopefully get some questions.
Yeah, there's only 2 questions in the chat, Dennis.
Okay, let's read the first one first.
They'll come in some more. Let's start with them. Where's the best place to hang a feeder on your house?
Okay, that's
near your house.
Yeah, you know, I don't think it matters a tremendous amount to the hummingbirds. I do keep some feeders out in the shady areas and some in the sunlight, and I don't really see a big difference in which ones they prefer. Where that comes in handy is that it seems like the yellow jackets prefer to be in the ones on the ones that are in the sun rather than the ones in the shade. So there's a little difference because of that. But hopefully the waspinator is going to solve that problem. We won't have the yellow jackets anyway.
Larry asked a question about where's the best place to look for a nest, and I was wondering, do hummingbirds have a preference for where they build their nests?
I'm going to get to that in just a second. I've got one more part I should have said about the location, but then I'll get to this other question. So sometimes people ask me, well, how high should you hang a feeder? I've seen people hanging hummingbird feeders 6 inches off the ground in Ecuador. And I was talking to someone last year who told me that he noticed that hummingbirds were coming to the potted plants he had on his patio on the 4th floor of his apartment building. So he set up a hummingbird feeder up there. And so anywhere between the 4 stories up and 6 inches off the ground will work as far as height. So
interesting.
Okay, so you want to give me that other question again? I'm sorry.
Where do they prefer to build their nests, and where should we look for them?
Yeah, I don't think there's a specific tree type that they prefer. I have found nests in box elders. I've found nests in large trees. So conifer versus deciduous doesn't seem to make any difference to them at all. I don't really know how they choose their location, to tell you the truth, but to look for them, you more or less stumble upon them unless you do manage to catch the female gathering nesting material. And I have seen that happening at places like the Arboretum. And you'll notice that they're collecting material because they do like to use big fluffy plant materials. So something like the fluff from a cattail stem or pod. I've seen them flying with that in their mouth, and so you got this big pile of fluff in their face. It's pretty obvious what they're doing, and if you see a hummingbird doing that, then you can kind of track with them. I've watched them come to my feeders and tried to decide just how many different females are coming to my feeders, and I watch to see what direction they're going in when they leave. And the problem is you don't know if they're going to another food source or they actually are going back to the nest. And, sometimes I swear I'm looking at the same hummingbird, and they do all look different, right? They are individuals. You can probably separate them out as long as you don't have like 40 of them. And they'll end up going in different directions. They won't take the same route. So I don't know if they're hitting different feeding stations or exactly what they're doing. And that's another interesting point that I should probably make, is even though we put these feeding stations out, they don't utilize those exclusively. They probably get, maybe 20 or 25% of their food out of one of our unnatural, feeding stations. The rest of the time, they're going to be actually feeding on plants, getting nectar that way, or looking for insects, especially during the breeding season when they need all that much more protein. I'll see them ignoring my feeders completely, and they're still foraging around my yard, but they're looking obviously for insects rather than nectar.
Question about feeder with a suction cup that's attached to a window. You had a picture of one actually in your slides.
Mm-hmm.
And Rob has one like that, and he's concerned that maybe they'll crash into the window.
I've heard theories from some people that the closer you put your feeders to the windows, the less likely the birds are going to kill themselves. I don't know how effective that can be, but supposedly, they don't have enough time to pick up speed enough to, kill themselves hitting a window if it's super close. I don't know if that works or not. I did say that I was going to show you the feeder that I typically use, and this is it here. You could see it in the video or in my slide program. It was the one that I was actually taking apart. And the reason I like it is that it does have a big mouth for the reservoir. So you can see that's very large. I mean, that's like tennis ball size.
Mm-hmm.
So you can easily swab that out, clean out any bacteria anywhere within that reservoir. So that's a big plus. Because some of these feeders, they have the reservoir, but it comes down to, an opening about the size of a pop bottle. And now it's much harder to get in there and clean. So this is very, very easy to clean. And then the saucer part, it's just one easy, there it goes, real easy. This is a brand new one, so it's a little stiff. But so that just, with one little turn, that opens up. And so now, you can see that that's very easy to get at as well. Okay. You can see this design does not have the little bee guards. And I don't really care much for the bee guards because that's just another place for bacteria to grow, and those are very difficult to clean. So I go a route where I don't have to worry about getting into the little nooks and crannies of the bee guards. So this comes apart very easily, easy to get to every part of it very easily. So this is my favorite, and the people that make this, it's called First Nature. Yeah, First Nature, and you'd easily find that online someplace. So, or you
How many of those hummingbird feeders do you have?
I only keep 2 or 3 active at one time, but I always keep extra ones around so I can rotate them out. So in doing that cleaning process, you can always have a couple in reserve, so you can have those cleaned and ready to go, and then make the switch so they're not, we don't want those impatient hummingbirds to be, attacking people in the ear and in the nose. So you want to make sure that you have readily available feeders for them. So I don't really put that many out. I don't have a big yard, and like I mentioned, if I get 4 or 5 hummingbirds in the yard, that's about it. So some people who are lucky enough to have, gobs of hummingbirds, and there are people that are that lucky, then you might need more feeders, and you need to space them out, put them in places so that, one aggressive hummingbird doesn't fight everybody else off. So you have to sometimes put them around the corner of the house. So a hummingbird can't visually see every single feeder in your yard. You have to outsmart those little guys. They're pretty tricky.
In spite of a small brain.
Right, exactly, yeah.
Question about someone had about your trips that you take. Is that a group trip with the DuPage Birding Club, or do you go off on your own? How do you arrange a birding trip?
Yeah, I organize the trips myself, sort of. I actually I've been working with a company down in Austin, Texas. It's called Field Guides, and they do birding trips all over the world. They have their own set catalog of trips that they do. And so I'll run a private tour through them. So I find, 8 or 10 people that want to go, and So in Oaxaca, there were 9 people plus me. And what I do is we work together to come up with the itinerary, which quite often, looks like what their public offering is. And then they take care of all the issues of logistics of lodging and things like that. They actually provide a guide. And then I have the group. And what we do is we all come to my house if we're going to, like, we're going to go to northern Peru. So that the list for that trip is probably going to be 650 species or something like that. So it takes a while to study all of those birds. So I'll have people come to my house for 5 or 6 weeks in a row, and I make dinner, and then in the evening we sit around and we discuss how to tell this hummingbird from that hummingbird, or this flycatcher from that flycatcher. So that's kind of how I've been doing it for about 20 years now. And then I go on my own family trips as well. Like when we were down in Costa Rica this past January, that was just my wife and I. And that was to locate a couple of hummingbirds that eluded me this time. So I'm going back again next January. I've got a better plan for the next time around.
Question about banding. Who bands birds? And it's got to be a real delicate thing when you're talking about a hummingbird. How do you catch it?
They use mist nets. A mist net is like a real fine woven nest or net, and the way it's laid out. Think of like fishnet stockings with holes about that big. Okay, so the way it's set up, you have two standards, and you stretch the net out. But the way the net is designed is it's coming down, and then it comes back up. It forms a pocket, and then goes down again, and comes back up and forms a pocket. So you have all these pockets. So when a bird flies hits the net, they crumple, they fall into the pocket, and they just get themselves kind of tangled up in there. They use this for all birds. They use it for catching raptors. They use them for all sorts of songbirds, and the same kind of application for hummingbirds. So what they would do in the case, I wasn't there when they trapped that bird in Lyle, but probably what they did, since that was the major food source, they probably set up the mist net in a way, and they probably had already watched the hummingbird. They knew which direction it came from and everything. So they probably put the mist net between where the bird was going to come from and the feeder itself, and the bird probably just flew right into that. So, okay, now they've got the hummingbird. Now, there are a lot of bird banders out there, but you do have to have special certification in order to do hummingbirds, because yes, those bands they put on are extremely tiny, and these birds. I've had hummingbirds in my hand, and I mean, they're literally, a ruby-throated hummingbird is really the size of my pinky. I mean, they're just so tiny. We tend to not realize just how small they are, because we're quite often looking at them through binoculars that are 7 power or 10 power, and you lose that perspective on just how small these animals are. They're very, very tiny. So it is something that not everyone can do. You have to be licensed to do banding to begin with, and you need even special certification for doing hummingbirds.
When did you first become interested in hummingbirds?
Well, I first got started in birding in the mid-'80s, and it was kind of a funny thing. We had taken a class in photography at the Morton Arboretum. We would go out west and visit all the national parks and take pictures of moose and elk and anything else that tromped in front of us, and then landscapes and all that. And that got a little boring. But while we were out there, you would obviously see some birds. So one year we were heading out, and I said, gee, wouldn't it be kind of cool to just put a name to some of these birds? And we went out and we saw things like Steller's jays and western tanagers and evening grosbeaks. And I commented to my wife, it's a pity we don't have beautiful birds like this at home. And then the next spring I discovered migration and found out about warblers and all sorts of things like that. And so about that time, my wife was going back to school to get a master's in speech pathology. So I had no one to play with, and I just birded my brains out. And by the time she finished, she got her degree. And the next time she went out birding with me, she literally said, "What happened to you?" So somewhere in that mix, I became mostly intrigued with hummingbirds, and they are just really fascinating animals. So it is a shame that I don't have one to play with here, but it does give me an excuse to travel all over South and Central America I didn't make that point when I showed you those maps, but hummingbirds are only found in the Western Hemisphere. So you don't find them in Asia. You don't find them in Australia. You don't find them in Europe. Oddly enough, the oldest known hummingbird fossil is from Germany, though. So 50 million years ago, there were hummingbirds apparently in that part of the world. But our world looked a lot different 50 million years ago, too. So the continents were in different positions. But hummingbirds existed there back then, but they do not now. They're all in the Western Hemisphere.
Question about, I mean, should we be putting our feeders out now?
Absolutely. I haven't put mine out yet, but you should put yours out. They are just arriving. And so these are the advanced guard of hummingbirds. And there'll be more on the way very soon. So you might as well get ready for them. Now, the temperatures have been relatively cool, so you probably don't have to be too concerned about changing that hummingbird nectar as often as I was talking about here in the beginning of the season. But you get the feeders out there and somebody's going to hit on it. It's just a matter of time. So yeah, I would put them out. And a lesson learned when it comes to the fall, people always ask me, well, when should I take my feeders in? Well, I now think that you should leave them out as long as you possibly can. In the case of this rufous hummingbird, that was a lifeline for that bird. I don't know what its food source would have been had that feeder not been there. Obviously, it had some other food sources because it did not spend its entire day in December sitting there just watching that feeder. So it must have been getting insects from somewhere, maybe robbing spiderweb nest, webbing, or going to trees and finding injuries on trees and getting sap that way. So it had to have had other food sources. But you can think of your hummingbird feeder as a lifeline for those guys in the fall. And that was December 1. So you can keep, I never used to keep my hummingbird feeders out that late, but I am now after that experience.
Keeping the feeder out won't make them not migrate, will it?
It will not. As that bird demonstrated, the day that it left, they had been keeping real close tabs because the family was fascinated with this hummingbird. So they were really keeping close tabs, and they noticed the change in its behavior that day, and it just fed very, very aggressively on the feeder in the morning and just was making, visit after visit after visit. It just really chowed down, and then bam, it was gone. So that hummingbird didn't just all of a sudden perish. It took off. It did leave. And as I've mentioned, and this is true with all birds, they'll utilize your food source that you supply, but it's not the one and only food source for them. So that one and only food source is not going to be the thing that keeps them from migrating. The urge to migrate is much stronger than that food source.
How long does it take them to get from here back to where they should be at that time of year? They can't go that far that fast, can they?
I would have to look back and do a little research on that one. There have been studies to figure out how far they can get on X number of grams of fat. And I think if my recollection is correct, I think they can push 125 miles easily in a day. That's no big deal for them. In fact, if they have to fly across the Gulf of Mexico, and we know that they do that, that's a 500-mile span. So they can do that on one tank of fuel. So so they can fly pretty long distances. Now, to answer the other half of that question of how long does it take to get from point A to point B, that map that I showed in my PowerPoint that had the dates, first arrival dates that there's all people all across the country, they're watching their feeders, and when they see their first ruby-throated come in, they go to that website and they say, oh, I just had one today. So you can probably look at that chart that I showed for 2010, and if you go to that website that was at the bottom of that page, you can actually go to their website, and the most current one I think I saw on there was for 2018. But you can look at that and you can actually track and see the dates that they're showing up in various places. So about 2 weeks ago, I got a call from my brother-in-law down in, he's just south of Chattanooga, and he had his first hit of a hummingbird about 2 weeks ago. And so I'm just now starting to hear about them hitting feeders around here. Last time I checked earlier in the week, they were as far north as St. Louis. So they're kind of chugging along. Part of it, they can probably go further than we can imagine, but they also can't outstrip their food sources. So they could race up here and then, you know, be stuck because there's no food sources. So they kind of timed their migration so that they do have food sources along the way. And that's another interesting point that a lot of people probably don't know. But they've found out that ruby-throated hummingbirds kind of correlate their migration with that of yellow-bellied sapsuckers, of all things. So those yellow-bellied sapsuckers are helping to create a food source for them. So they're migrating in advance of the ruby-throated hummingbirds, and they're creating those sap wells. And so they've determined that ruby-throated hummingbirds really don't push the envelope past how far the sapsuckers have already migrated. So that there is a correlation between those two migrations, and the sapsuckers are kind of driving the whole show.
What was that website again?
I don't have it at my fingertips. So you guys will have to watch you're going to have to watch me talk through this whole video all over again.
Okay, well, we have that. This is being recorded.
Yeah, right, exactly. I can send that to you afterwards. I don't have it at my fingertips.
Yes.
And then you could share it with all the attendees if you would like.
Oh, I did have a question about, well, here, Joe asked a very interesting question. A lot in the news lately, there's been this warning about avian flu, and concern about putting out any feeders that attract birds. Does that apply to hummingbirds?
Well, first off, it's from what I've read so far, it seems like the exposure is more in waterfowl and gallinaceous birds, chickens. So chicken type birds and waterfowl. And they're not really seeing real impact on songbirds. Then you can take that one step further to hummingbirds. And it's probably not likely that, you know, there's going to be passage of that virus between those groups of birds, the songbirds and the hummingbirds. And I can't say that for a fact, but so far the state has not given us any direction on not putting out songbird feeders. So the typical feeders you have in your backyard. So at this point, they're not alerting us to not put out feeders. So I would say it's probably still okay. But I have had mallards in my yard. Just this evening, there were 2 mallards walking across the yard. So now I've got waterfowl. So that complicates things. But to be honest, I don't put bird feeders out. The only feeders I put out are hummingbird feeders. I leave the songbirds to their own devices. I have a native backyard. It's a very shaded yard. So my backyard is 3/4 woodland. Sedges and ephemerals right now. Probably almost 3/4 of my yard is Carex pennsylvanica. So it's an interesting yard. My neighbors always ask me if I can mow it, and I'm like, why do I want to mow that?
Speaking of feeders, Deb asks, should you just take your feeders in when you go on vacation because you're not going to be around to clean them?
Right, so that is a problem. I had to go on vacation last summer. Had to go on vacation. I went on vacation last summer, and I did get one of my neighbors to watch over my feeders for me. Otherwise, yeah, the smartest thing to do would be to take them in, and they will reestablish usage of those when you come back and you put it back out. They'll be more than happy to revisit that. It would probably be worse to let them just sit out there and run dry, or let bacteria build up. That would be a bigger problem. Sometimes when that happens, where you let a feeder go dry, the hummingbirds remember that flower no longer is producing nectar, and sometimes just to get them restarted again, you may actually have to move the feeder a little bit. So voila, all of a sudden it's a new flower in a new spot. So that could be potentially something that happens.
Hummingbird psychology, huh?
Yeah. As you mentioned, they've got this little tiny brain, but
They're outsmarted
they
us.
can probably outsmart us. They can certainly fly better than us.
We have, we typically put out 2 hummingbird feeders at either end of our deck. And what happens is that a hummingbird will sit on a tree between the 2 and move its head back and forth and back and forth. And when another hummingbird comes by to one of the feeders, it races down there and chases it away and then goes back to its perch.
Mhm.
They seem to be very territorial. Do you ever see a bunch of hummingbirds at a feeder at one time? My wife took a trip out to Oregon and not Oregon, Idaho.
Yeah.
Idaho, and she said that there were many, many, many birds at one feeder there.
Yeah, I think it depends on the species. And so our ruby-throateds do tend to be extremely territorial. You know, I've made trips to South America a few times, and some of the feeding stations there are incredible. You can have hundreds of hummingbirds around. They're not all at the feeder at one time, but there's just hundreds of hummingbirds all around. And in those situations, I've seen feeding stations. In fact, they don't even have ports. I've seen hummingbird stations where it's basically a big disc, an open disc, and all the nectar is just, it's like a little pond, right? And so they alight on the edge and they all just kind of line up. And I've seen 30 or 40 hummingbirds feeding off of one feeder that's like in that kind of a situation. So it kind of depends on the species. And I do a talk actually on hummingbirds of the world. And in there, I talk a little bit more about the fact that you have these guilds of hummingbirds. You know, we don't have that going on here because we've got just one species. But in other parts of the world, you have a guild of hummingbirds that are in a certain region. And so they all have their specialties as far as how they feed, when they feed, and they have different strategies for getting their food. And so all of those various niches that they carve out for themselves all mesh together so that they don't have as many problems. But we just got this one species and it happens to be an ornery one. So they've never attacked me, but always be aware. Use a lot of caution. Use a hard hat when you go out there.
I'd hate to get stabbed by a hummingbird.
Yeah, it was quite remarkable when it happened, but I wouldn't wish it on anyone. I would have had pictures of that too, but my friend was laughing way too much to take pictures. I only have that one picture of the one on my finger, but then after that, she was laughing too much. So, so we didn't get, I would have loved to have had that captured on a little video or something like that, but pretty wild stuff.
When the birds are building their nest, would it hurt if we left nesting material out for them? And if we did, what would we leave?
I don't know that they will utilize materials that they are not commandeering themselves. You know, I mean, to go and just scoop up some fuzz or something off the ground. I don't know if they would use that. They certainly have a long history with the plant species that they do utilize. And so how specialized it is that they would only use those, I'm not sure. But you have to remember all these things that have evolved over hundreds of thousands of years. You know, insects only use certain plants. So they have host plants for their egg laying. They have host plants, you know, that they use when they are gathering nectar for themselves. The hummingbirds are the same way. So all these relationships have evolved over a very, very long time. So they probably have certain plant species. As I mentioned, you know, the cattail fluff, they certainly seem to like using lichens off of trees, you know, for camouflage purposes. But there's a lot of uniformity in the building of the nest. And so if you get into some of these papers that have been written on how the nests are composed, you'll find that they're using a lot of the same materials over and over and over again. So us volunteering, you know, a piece of yarn or something like that is probably not as likely to happen. The birds that do use those kinds of things are usually like the house sparrows, and they build those real big, messy, sloppy nests. And I think they'll grab anything that's available. So those guys will probably use all your little bits of yarn.
See that Roger has some information about putting bird feeders out to It's in the chat window, Rich.
Yeah, I was going to say that the Illinois Department of Natural Resources recommends not using bird feeders and bird baths through the end of May.
Oh, okay.
Now I don't know if that includes hummingbird feeders or not.
Yeah, I wouldn't be able to answer that either. I'm probably going to put mine out and hope for the best, I guess. But that's the first time I've heard of any direction from the state. So thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, well, we get multiple finches at our feeder.
Mm-hmm.
And it's when birds congregate in groups that the flu gets passed. Like I said, we've never had more than one hummingbird feeder at the feeder one hummingbird feeding at the feeder at a time.
Right.
So they don't tend to congregate in big flocks.
Right, but they could probably, I don't know how the virus is transferred. I don't know if they can leave it on the feeder for the next feeding hummingbird or not. So.
Oh, I don't know.
Yeah. So there are a lot of unknowns, and like as I mentioned earlier, all reports that I had read up to this point were that it was concentrated in those other groups of birds, waterfowl and gallinaceous birds.
We're pretty much out of questions,
Okay.
unless anyone has anything that they want to ask. Just unmute yourself and ask away. Sometimes questions are too hard to type into a chat window.
I just wanted to say that I live in Lisle, so I'm going to be looking out for late residents of hummingbirds.
Yeah,
I never would have left my feeder out that late though.
I was really surprised that I don't know if it was an accident that they happened to leave it out. I don't know that, because these people were not like big birders or anything. They really didn't know much about birds, and it may have been just a coincidence that the feeder was left up long enough so that this rufous hummingbird could take advantage of it. And that wasn't the only rufous that showed up in the area. Afterwards, I found out that there had been one in Naperville as well. And I live in Naperville. That one, of course, with Naperville, it might have been closer to go to Lisle than the other side of Naperville.
Yeah, we never know.
Right.
And I've also experienced having the hummingbirds fly right through my water when I'm watering the garden. And they fly right through it and almost up into my face, you know.
Yeah. That's a fun experience.
It is.
It's a fun experience. Everybody should try to experience that. If you do see a hummingbird around, just lighten up on the mist, and it's amazing. They'll just fly right through it. I've also had them alight on after I have been watering, and you have all the water beating up on large leafed plant surfaces. They'll actually alight on those leaves. And as light as they are, they don't really upset the balance of anything. And they actually kind of roll their body into those water droplets and collect the water that way. So that's kind of interesting to see that as well.
Dennis, do you work with Journey North? Is it journeynorth.org? I believe they have a tracking for monarchs and hummingbirds. I believe it's through the University of Wisconsin.
No, I'm not aware of that.
Okay. I know that they do it for monarchs, but I think they do it for hummingbirds too.
Okay.
So, and I think it's just journeynorth.org.
Okay. I don't typically focus that much on tracking them unless I'm doing a talk like this. So over the last couple of days, I kind of was trying to keep an eye out so I could give you a full report on where they might be. But I'm sorry. Arrived here. So pardon?
Well, the other one is like the Audubon, the Great Backyard Bird Count or whatever. Do they count? Well, of course, we don't have hummingbirds in our area when they're counting that.
I don't know how much the other tracking. The other thing that you can use is eBird. I don't know if you guys are familiar with eBird, but a lot of people, they put all of their bird lists into eBird. And so if they recorded a hummingbird, in their list for the day, it would be recorded there for a particular hotspot. So you can look at the hotspot map and see where all the ruby-throated hummingbirds are being seen. That's kind of how I was tracking them, actually, and watching. That's how I knew that they were showing up in St. Louis. And then I started seeing some records of them showing up in Ohio as well. So it wasn't until just today that I started hearing that there are hummingbirds in our local area. So they're just now arriving. But if you look back at that data from 2010, they were actually here on April 4th. So there is some variability in when they show up. And it has a lot to do with the weather. Also has to do with what those yellow-bellied sapsuckers are doing. So,
Well, this was so enjoyable. I really, I learned a lot, and I didn't know it was good to put the feeders out so soon. So
yeah,
I just took all my feeders down and washed them, and of course my hummingbird feeder's been in the cupboard, and the Oriole feeder too. I usually wait longer, but I guess I'll put it out.
Yeah, we're getting towards the end of April, so even those Orioles are going to be popping up here very, very soon.
Yeah.
And with these feeders, a regular seed feeder or a bird bath, they probably don't get cleaned as often as they should. But I think if you're really religious about cleaning that hummingbird feeder, that's going to minimize the impact of this avian flu. Well, if it even is getting into the hummingbirds,
Yeah.
it's a little bit of an unknown if that's going to be a problem or not. But
Yeah. Well, I may wait a little longer with the seed feeder. I don't know. I was gonna do some, asking around at, different people and find out if it's okay to put them out or not. Because
I'm going to be doing the same thing, because it's better to err on the side of caution.
Yeah.
When you think about we don't want to do anything to these birds to upset their lives any more than we already have. There's been those studies that have come out that have shown that we've lost over 3 billion birds in North America since 1970. And I mean, I've been birding all through that window, more or less. And so I can certainly see that anecdotally that, these birds are just disappearing. It's so much harder for me to find, species that I used to consider, way more common and it's something that I would run into very frequently. And now I just don't see them anywhere near as often as I used to. And it's frustrating. I teach classes at the Morton Arboretum, and I've been doing that for 25 years now. And, I take groups out, and it's just, I feel almost like I need to apologize every day. I think of the good old days. And in fact, that was something that I meant to mention if anyone is interested. I do have 2 classes at the Arboretum coming up, and they're going to be starting next week. One of them is spring warblers, and the other one is a field class that's called Field Study Birds of Spring. And so both of those still have openings in them. And if you want to learn a little bit more about birds, the Birds of Spring class is actually a 5-week class. I think it's 5 Saturdays, if I'm not mistaken. And it'd be a great opportunity. That way you'd get all my jokes and everything too. So yeah. I hear that's the best part. So anyway, if anyone's interested in those classes, check them out at the Arboretum. They're like I said, they're both starting next week, so you'd have to kind of scramble a little bit, but there are some other ways to get some more information on birds, certainly.
Okay, well, thank you very much. This
was with that, I think
wonderful. We had a lot of positive feedback from people about the pros. Some people have already checked out, but we had a good group and lots of good questions. And
yeah, I thought it was great.
Yeah.
I just have to figure out what that J is on Rich's wall over there now, and then I'll be able to sleep tonight.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you so very much.
Okay, thanks everyone for showing up tonight.
Thank you.
And thank goodness for Zoom, so we can do it this way.
Oh my goodness, yes.
The commute is wonderful.
Yeah,
Thanks a
I
lot.
agree.
Yep.